Thank you. I'm just the organizer today. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome Azure Skåne session. We are all here to listen to Ejlskov Jensen talk about Azure SQL with App Service and Azure Active Directory. I'm really looking forward to it. Eric, thank you for accepting our invitation. Let's see if we can go forward with the presentation. How come it's not going to the next slide? We have a little technical glitch right here at the beginning. No, it's not here, I think. We can stop and try again. We thought it was too good to be true. Need this mic. You hear me quite well. All right. Sorry, people online. Apologies. Yeah, so we have some agenda. I will go through the agenda. We spent the first, 5 to 10 minutes to go through some meet and greet, some intro slides before I hand it over to you, Eric. And then, of course, after Eric is done, we have the Q&A section of the session, as always, and we're going to have some pizza. As you know, Azure Skåne is a user group with focus on Microsoft Cloud. We are all here to network and learn and also have fun. Azure Skåne organizer group is listed on this slide. As you can see, I'm also squeezed in there. I have recently joined this team, and I'm really excited and happy about it, to be a feminine representative of the technical community, finally. My name is Negar Shabuz. I work as a Microsoft Cloud solution architect, working with Microsoft Azure integration solutions, Microsoft 365, and Power Platform governance. And as you see in the team, we have Goran, Magnus, and Michael, who are the pioneers of the group, I believe. Today, I will be the host, and Michael is here to hold my hands in case I break something. Anyways, for the attendees online, Azure Skåne is a user group based in Malmö, actually in Skåne area, which is the southern province in Sweden. And of course, we have a little bridge that connects us to Denmark. And we collaborate a lot with the communities in Denmark as well. As you know, today we have a guest speaker from Denmark, Ejlskov Jensen. For the ones that are here today and also our joiners online, please make some noise. On social media, you can use hashtag Azure Skåne. You can start tweeting or share pictures and posts on LinkedIn, we appreciate it. Let's make some noise. We have two sponsors for today. We have Capish, who is sponsoring the event today, and also Foo Café, as everybody knows. I'm gonna pass on the mic to our friend Anders.
Thank you very much. My name is Anders Högberg, and Capish is right over the street, where we do software for making medical and clinical research faster and smoother. Are we here just because of the good in our heart? Yeah, partly. But we're also looking for some really good front-end and full-stack developers. So if you are one or knows one, please approach me during the break. Over and out.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, front-end full-stack developer. Do you take contracts? Subcontracts? Okay. I have people on the bench. I'm looking for projects. Just a little heads up here. Our very next session after this one is going to take place on April 25th. So you're all welcome to join that session as well. It's going to be a cool session on the topic of caching in the cloud. If you yourselves are interested in speaking, putting yourselves out there, challenging yourselves, or just sharing knowledge with the community, please feel free to submit your presentations and sessions ideas at the link provided here. And I think this one is the Discord slide, right? We also have Azure Skåne Discord, which you can join. There is an invitation link on the slide. And with that said, I would like to hand it over to our very dear guest speaker, Mr. Erik Jensen. Varsågod, Erik.
I think I managed to unmute myself there. Tack ska du ha. There we are. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm here to talk about managed identity with the example of using App Service with Azure SQL database, but really managed identity is something that applies to numerous Azure services. So this is just an example. And I would also like to show something that's a little bit hard and undocumented, so you can take advantage of that when you're using managed identity with Azure SQL database in a constrained environment where you don't have full Active Directory access from your deployment pipeline, etc. So first we'll start with an overview of what is managed identity, a little dive into how does it work, and then we will actually do a live deployment while I'm speaking, just to demonstrate how easy it is to get started. I will deploy some resources to a resource group, and then we will gradually work through deploying our infrastructure, an app, and then find out why the app is not working, and then make it work. Time permitting, we will also take a look under the hood. I have a feeling that there will not be a lot of time for that, but let's see. So what is managed identity? It was formerly referred to as something called MSI. Managed identity is a feature of Active Directory, which is something that creates a service principal in the that is tied to the Azure service itself. So it creates a service principal in the Active Directory of the tenant that your Azure subscription belongs to, and then that managed identity is then tied to an Azure service. That's what it used to be. That's what a system-assigned managed identity is. And then applications that host on those services, it started being a feature on virtual machines, but now almost all compute services support managed identity. They can retrieve a token from the MSI service and then use that to authenticate against Active Directory. So you have an identity enabled for an application that's running on that trusted platform, and therefore you don't need to store passwords because it's all taken care of by Active Directory. So you can centrally control the lifecycle and permissions of that underlying Active Directory object. So if something goes rogue, or you feel that something has, if you are monitoring something and feels like it has gotten too much rights, you can revoke it or disable that account, and the application will stop functioning. So how does App Service work with a managed identity? There is actually a hosted service in the App Service compute, where that is called the managed identity, the MSI token service, and your app will then request a token from the service on the machine, and on your behalf it will request a token representing the machine identity, the managed identity, from Active Directory. It will receive the token and pass it on to the service. It's just a standard DWT token, and then with that token you can request services or connect to other so storage services, database services, and so on, using that token. Lifetime, of course, is limited, so will not last forever, but everything is taken care of, and most implementations have automatic renewal and so on. So you don't, as a user or even a developer, don't need to take care of that. That's all part of the framework that you're using, the SQL client, .NET framework, etc. And then, of course, the calling service can verify the token, look at its properties, and can also do a call to the Active Directory to actually verify that the token is valid and properly authenticated. So there's actually, as I alluded to before, there's actually two types of managed identity, which is system assigned. So when you create a resource, in this example an app service or a function app or whatever, and system assigned identity can be enabled for that service. It's not there by default, it's something you have to opt into. And when the service, so when the app service is deleted, that system assigned identity is also removed. So the lifespan of those two objects, if you wish, are the same, or you can also say that the system assigned identity is just a sub-property of the app service. But you can also create something that is called user assigned managed identity. And that is a separate resource, Azure object. I will show you in the resource group later what it looks like. And it can be associated with multiple services. So you can say, I want my managed identity to access my storage account, my database service, my key vault if you're using that. But in this scenario, we actually don't need a key vault because we don't have any secrets to store. Of course, there's an issue with deletion of managed identities, and the recommendation right now is to use logs, because you can actually prevent yourself from accessing your storage or your database server if you accidentally delete the managed identity, because then you don't have an identity that has access to that resource anymore. Microsoft is working on improving that situation by warning you about dependencies of that managed identity before you delete it. So, and I think they're also thinking about doing something like soft delete, similar to what we know from Key Vault. So when you delete a user-assigned managed identity, it will be deactivated and stored somewhere, and then you can actually reactivate it. So for whatever 90 days, or like with the Key Vault. So in this sample deployment, we're going to deploy a database with some firewall rules, a connection string, of course, that connects the database and the managed identity and the web app. And we're going to add application insights. I don't know how far we'll get with that, but we're just going to add it just because we can. So we can monitor our app and log errors and so on. I'm hoping we'll see some errors. So the parts of deployment is to provide a web app with passwordless access to an Azure SQL database. And my design goals for this demo is I didn't want to start just an Azure DevOps pipeline or some GitHub actions and just let it run. I will do everything from the command line. But the pieces of code that I'm sharing can easily be adapted and put into some tasks in either GitHub actions or on Azure DevOps pipeline. I have chosen to use minimal amount of code for each of the parts. So for infrastructure, I have chosen Bicep, which is a very compact language for defining infrastructure. Maybe you have been working with ARM templates before, which are extremely verbose and can quickly get completely out of control. That's certainly my experience anyway. Whereas Bicep is very compact and just has absolutely necessary default values. So absolutely only required values are needed, and everything else are just useful, clever default values, which makes the Bicep files much compacter and much better to work with. There's also other programmability features of Bicep because it's a type language, so the tooling for Bicep is much better than JSON, a huge JSON file. It's not JSON, but it's better JSON. For the application, I have chosen to do a .NET 6 minimal API because with a minimum amount of lines of code, you can actually produce something semi-useful, let's say that, with a web API, web API, and we'll publish that to the web app. And for the configuration, I'm using PowerShell Core. You could also just use Azure CLI. It's completely the same things you can do. It's just a wrapper over the ARM API anyway. But for this demo, I'm just choosing to use PowerShell Core. So let's dive into the demo. So first, so it's the demo is like there's three elements in this. The first part is a Bicep. Oh, that's not the Bicep file. Here, yeah. The first part is a Bicep file. It's quite similar to an ARM template, but you can see there's syntax highlighting, and if I start coding in it, I will get IntelliSense and things like that. So it's a much nicer experience. And it knows about all the underlying objects, so it knows what properties are required, and it knows what all the properties are. So you get all the help you can get from a modern programming language by using this. And I'm using Visual Studio. There's an extension for Visual Studio that enables Bicep language understanding, but you can also use code. It has a slightly better Bicep editing experience. It also has some visualizations. The image I showed you earlier with the pieces that we were going to deploy was actually generated using a Bicep template, and then you can just right-click on it and say visualize the Bicep template. So that's a really nice way to do a quick architecture drawing. So it's like code-first architecture instead of drawing-first architecture. So yes. So the Bicep template defines all the resources that we're going to deploy, the database, the firewall rules. I will just quickly scroll through this because I think it may will quickly run out of time. And then, of course, the managed identity, and I'm choosing to do a user-assigned managed identity for this purpose. I could also just use a system-assigned managed identity, but I think there are multiple advantages of using a user-assigned managed identity. You are much more in control, and for the scenario that we are going to enable, you need a user-assigned managed identity because you can query certain properties that you cannot query from something that only exists as a system-assigned identity for whatever reason. I'm not really sure why, but that's just what it is like. So we're adding some monitoring to a web app, in this case, Application Insights, and of course the hosting plan and the web app itself. So this one is actually, I know we're not talking about Key Vault. It was something I discovered recently. So you can have one system assigned identity, and then you can actually have multiple managed identities assigned to a single web app. So you can have like X number of identities assigned to the same app. So when you are using keyword references, I don't know if you use some of those special syntax for referencing a value in the key vault from application configuration, then which identity is actually used, that you define by setting this keyword reference identity property. I don't see it anywhere in the UI, but it's very useful, because then you can actually say that it's this identity I want to use for reading secrets from the keyword. We're not using a keyword. I just thought I would share this little find I had recently with you. And of course, we need to define our connection string. So, and that's part of the magic source of all this, is of course defining a connection strings that tells the underlying SQL client driver that we are wanting to use managed identity. So let's have a little bit of a closer look at this one. So I'm just gonna paste it in Notepad, and just gonna say font, increase the font a bit. So let's just try to break down the, actually let's just, while we're doing this, why don't we start the deployment? So now I'm going to run the bicep file you just saw, and it's the deploy script. Let's just have a quick look at what that does. So I'm setting the environment to demo. I'm actually also showing us an interesting little trick here. So sometimes you want either your pipeline's IP, or in this case it's my own IP, to be a part of a firewall rule. And this little trick will actually tell you what your current external IP is, and then you can pass that IP value on to your pipeline as a parameter, which I'm doing here. And then I'm setting a firewall rule that allows my current external IP access to the SQL database. Because time permitting, I will actually show you something inside the SQL database. And in order to do that, I need a firewall rule that will allow me access. So let's try to run this. Before we do that, I'm just going to show you that this is the resource group I'm deploying into. So let's just quickly refresh and just show you that I'm not cheating. It's completely empty, and hopefully it will be full of something very soon. So let's go back to the connection string. So let's break this down. So we have the data source, which is the server name. There's nothing unusual there. We have the initial catalog, which is the name of the database. It's always recommended to have a connection timeout of at least 60 seconds when you're connecting to an Azure SQL database, a single database. And then encrypt should be true, makes sense. So the important part here is actually the user ID and the authentication setting. So the authentication type should be Active Directory Managed Identity. I think you can also use Active Directory Default, but this is definitely targeted at Managed Identity. And then when you are using a user assigned, if you're using a system assigned identity, you don't need a user ID. If you're using a user assigned identity, you need to tell the client which one is it. So you need to pass the client ID of the managed identity as the user ID. It's just a GUID. We will see when the app has been deployed what it looks like when it's actually replaced with these values, of course, representing the actual values that will be used during deployment. So let's see if something is happening here. So for the app, as I said, this is just a .NET 6 web API, sorry. And I have added support for application insights by adding the application insight package. And then I have added one of my own packages, which is supports something called SQL data source. So you don't need to pass connection strings around to your services or inject a connection string into your individual services and then new up a connection. This package will new up the connection for you, and so you just have to define the connection string in one place, with allowing you to use ADO.NET from all your controllers or services using dependency injection. I will show you a little bit later, a bit further down. So we're adding the data source, and it will get the connection string from my application settings. We have also added Swagger, which is a way to explore an API on your developer machine via a web interface. We will use HTTPS, and then we have a single GET endpoint that returns JSON formatted SQL statement. So we will have nice nested payload coming out of this. And as you can see, I'm just injecting the SQL data source here into my my controller method, and I can just create a command. I don't need to say open connection or do anything. I just almost magic. So I don't need to say using command blah 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 blah. I just need to do using command, and it will just be there and know what the connection string is. And then I will pass that on as a JSON document to my as my payload. Let's just quickly try to run this. Now I'm running this against my own local database, of course, just to show the Swagger UI. So we have the single method here. I can try it out and press execute. And if the demo gods are with me, we should be able to see something coming out of it. Yes. So this is something from the AdventureWorks database, which you can see is like nicely nested JSON simply by specifying, by authoring the SQL statement in a special way. So that's the app. So let's see. Yeah, it looks like our deployment has finished. So let's go back to the resource group and press refresh. And now you can see the resources that I just defined are here. And notice that I have also bootstrapped my database with an AdventureWorks database sample. So the database, I don't need to populate it, already has an AdventureWorks LT database with content inside it, which of course I'm taking advantage of. So we have the managed identity object, as you can see further down the screen. So it's like a separate thing. It's a separate service inside our resource group. And yes, you wanted to ask something, Mikael? That is the user. Yeah, but the question is that the user assigned managed identity? And the answer is yes. That is the user assigned managed identity, which is a completely separate object outside anything else. And then you can, in your bicep, as you will see when you open it at home, you can see that I'm associating that managed identity with various services. So if we go into the managed identity itself, you would notice that it exposes two very interesting properties. It exposes its client ID, and it exposes its object ID. And there's a PowerShell command to get those values out, because you, as a normal pipeline user or a pipeline service or whatever, you cannot ask Active Directory for those properties on arbitrary accounts. But for this particular object, you can actually get hold of those values, which you need in order to assign the rights to, for example, into the connection string. So if we go back, let's just see. I have defined that my SQL server, my SQL server is using only Active Directory authentication. It's a new feature. Before you could mix, but now I have actually, if you try to log on with a SQL server username and a password, you will not be able to do it with this particular virtual server, because I have enabled this new feature. So you can only log on with an Active Directory account. And I have actually made myself, the administrator, usually would make either a pipeline to the Active Directory administrator if you only want the app to access the data, or you could also ask your AD administrator to create a security group and to make certain members of that pipeline, for example, security group, sorry. For example, your pipeline account should probably be a member of that security group, and somebody else that thinks they need access to the database. It varies, of course, what you need, but it doesn't have to be, what I'm saying is it doesn't have to be a single user, it can be a group. That is the admin name. It looks a bit strange. It looks a little bit like you can only set it to a person, but you can certainly set it to a security group as well. And yes, yeah, go ahead. It's not enabled. Let me put it like that. Yeah, it's not enabled, but it's in this context. It's actually not really important. But what I have done is something on the app. It's more important what I do on the outgoing side. And if you go to here to identity for the app, you can see a system assigned is not enabled. The system assigned identity is not enabled, but the user assigned identity is. You can also have both. You can have both system assigned and multiple. As I said before, you can have multiple user assigned. But I only have this app actually only has that single identity when it's presenting itself to the outside world. So now we got the resources deployed. Yes, there's another question. Yeah.
Thanks. If you go back to the actual managed identity object there.
Yes.
I saw there was a preview that you could actually see the associated resources.
Possibly,
if we could just have a look at that real quick.
Yeah. I didn't know how far that got. Yeah.
It's like the fifth or sixth from. Yeah, that's the one.
Yes, that's what I was mentioning earlier. Yes, I didn't know it had got that far. Yes, I was only involved.
Yeah. So I just wanted to see if you could actually, if you click on that, just wanted to see if you can actually see what it's been associated with.
Yeah, that's a good.
Thank you.
Yeah, it knows that it's associated with the app service. I'm looking forward to see whether it's actually finding out it's associated with something inside the SQL database. I have a feeling it won't be, but we'll see soon. So enough talk. Now we need to deploy the app. We just have the resources spinning there, costing money by the hour. So we definitely need to deploy an app so our users can start using our wonderful app. And for deployment, for the publishing, as it's called, I'm going to run .NET Publish on my app, and then I'm going to zip the publish output, and then I'm going to get hold of a reference to the web app in the fourth line, and then I will use the publish AC web app commandlet. Of course, there's many ways to publish a web app, but what happens under the cover is basically this, no matter how it's sugar-coated on top or what programming language it's happening in. It happens to be PowerShell in this case. So let's try to build and publish the app. So now I'm building the app, I'm compressing an archive with the app in it, and then the publish AC web app commandlet is basically uploading and unzipping that app in the app service. Or it might not even be unzipping it actually. It's not important. So now we actually have the app running, and I should be able to navigate to the /persons URL and get something out of it. Why don't we try to do that? So let's go to the app here. You can see it's now deployed with the connection string. So if we go into edit here, and now it has proper values like the name of the server and the name of the database that was part of our deployment script. So it's replaced with proper values. And if we scroll here, I don't know if you can see this, managed identity, blah, blah, blah. And here we have the user ID, which is the client ID of the managed identity. Excuse me. So, sorry. So let's go into the app and try to launch it. Any guesses what will happen now? We'll get a 404 because we're trying to load default HTML or something like that from the root of the app. It doesn't exist because this is an API, but certainly persons should exist because we have this exposed endpoint here called persons. So let's see what happens now. Oh, this is because I'm on test, sorry. I should be on demo because that's the one we just built. That's an app plan, app, and we'll launch the app. So we have created all the resources, deployed the app with a usable connection string because it's in the app configuration. Again, we're getting the 404, luckily, and I will go to the persons URL, and I get an error 500. Why did I do that? Maybe if we're lucky, we can at some point in time in the future, we can see this error in application insights and try to understand what's going on. If we're in a hurry, which we probably are, because the pizza's coming soon, we can go into Kudu, the advanced console, and then we can look in a file called event.log.xml in the file system of the web app to find out what happened. So I will just go and browse the web app. Is it in log files? Yes. So I can actually go in and edit that file and then try to figure out what happened. So we can see the actual error, the crash, .NET crash. You can see that here in the event.log.xml file in the log files folder in our web app. If we had, I think it will also eventually bubble up into application insights, but if we don't have that enabled, we forgot to enable it or whatever, we can always go in here and see something that's a complete crash of the app will always be logged in this file here. So if we got an error saying login failed for user token identified principal. The issue is that, of course, we have not given our managed identity any rights to log into the database. So the database doesn't know about this user because the database has an internal users table and it doesn't know anything about this managed identity. So even if we come with the correct credentials, with our correct token and so on, we're not able to connect. We need to fix that. So the last part of this is our configuration script, which is also this PowerShell script. Again, we have specified the names of some resources. I have a function that converts a GUID to something called a SID, which is like an old Windows concept. And basically, let's face it, SQL Server is an old Windows app. So it works internally with, not with GUIDs as user IDs, but with SIDs. And then we are getting, the pipeline is getting, pipeline in this case me, I'm getting a token to log on to the SQL Server. I'm the admin of the SQL Server, but I still need credentials to do it. So in this script, I request a token for the database.windows.net resource to get the access token for that. And I will also just write out the token to demonstrate it. And this is an important command I talked to about earlier. This get Azure assigned identity will enable us to get the resources, the properties like client ID and object ID of the managed resource. So we need the client ID in this case, and the client ID then needs to be converted to a SID, which is this function I showed you earlier, the object of that to do that. And then we actually need to execute some SQL that will create a user inside the user database, inside AdventureWorks, which will create a system user with a managed identity name. And then I'm using this undocumented command here. Normally you will write from external provider and put the full name of the identity. But in this case, I'm in a constrained environment. In order to use from external provider, you actually need to be able to do lookups in Active Directory and look up that name and then resolve the client ID of that, the object ID, the client ID in that case of that name. And you can't, unless you give your pipeline special extra access, it can't do that. But using this undocumented command, shared by a Microsoft support person, you can actually circumvent this because you now is assigning a type of E, which also means external, but then you are, instead of assigning doing a lookup, you're doing a lookup for SQL. So it doesn't need to go out and ask Active Directory who is this and what is the ID. And then of course you need to give it some rights, the user some rights inside the database. It could just be DB owner, or it could be more constrained, or it could be even constrained down to individual object level. You can do all that inside the SQL database. I'm just assigning it data reader and data writer. Once we have composed this script with all the correct names and all the correct IDs, I'm going to execute that script against the database using my pipeline's credentials. In this case, it's actually me that's my account that's a pipeline, but somebody that is administrator or user administrator of that database must execute that, and it's in this case it's just a pipeline account. So I'm going to run the configuration now. Yes, of course. Yes.
Thanks. This is a great way to do it, but we won't be able to execute store procedures, and we need to add different roles depending on what we want the managed entity to do.
Sorry, you want to execute store procedures?
Yeah, if I need to, then I can't do it as a data reader or data writer.
Correct, but you can grant execute right on individual store procedures to the same user. As I said, you can grant this on completely granular level to a user. So you would just grant execute on store procedure name to this user instead of having these alter roles here.
Yeah, sure, and of course, but it is the SQL way. Do you know if Microsoft is working on a way to do it via bicep, like a command called like add?
I can't imagine why they would want to do that. But I don't see it. I don't see that happening any time in the near future. No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Thanks.
It has to happen inside the SQL database engine. It
Okay.
knows about its objects, and it needs to store data about those grants in system tables. So, it could be sugar-coated in something, but eventually there would be need to execute some SQL against the database that actually sets the grants for a particular object.
Okay. Thanks.
I'm sharing the token for fun at home. You can take the token and then you can paste it into a website called jwt.io, and you can inspect all the interesting properties of that token. I'm just going to spare you that. But if you want to find out what this token is, actually just a base 64 encoded thing that you can actually inspect in a browser app called jwt.io. There's probably other browser apps for that as well. Yeah, that's actually we could do a deeper dive in some things in the app service, but I think somebody's going to be annoyed with me. Will you just show you one quick thing though before we wrap up? See here, it's actually in advanced tools. Yes, we're there already. So how does the SQL client as I said, it uses an Azure identity library to actually call the identity service on the machine hosting the web app, the app service. But how does it know how does it know how to call this identity service, and how does it authenticate itself against this identity service? It does so via a couple of environment variables that's stored here on the app service. I don't know if I can zoom in a bit here. Yes. So you can see these two environment variables. One is the URL of the MSI endpoint, which of course is on localhost. It's hosted on the machine itself, on this MSI token thing here, and it will, when you're doing a calls to this, you will have to pass this MSI secret to it. So all that information is actually available here in clear text. And if you have access to query the Kudu, if you have a right to query the Kudu API, you can do that as well. But of course, you need to execute this from the machine itself, because it's addressing localhost. It only responds to localhost requests. Yes. So go home, get rid of all your SQL Server passwords and use managed identity instead. And think about using enable Active Directory only on all your SQL instances or SQL databases. Don't store any more passwords, because it's a nightmare to store passwords. And just lean back and enjoy. All the code that I have shown here is available in a GitHub repo at the address there, and there's a link to a list of all the services that support Azure managed identity, both as a compute part and as a part that can validate requests coming in from a service supporting managed identity. And I will of course share a link to the repo, and the repo actually also includes the slides. So.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you very much.
Are we going to take Q&A now, or are we going to go for the feedback? Thank you so much, Eric.
You're welcome.